Hi, everyone. I hope everyone is doing well this evening. This is the Canadian Foreign Policy Hour, and I am coming to you from Jojage, which has long been a meeting place of various First Nations, otherwise known as Montreal. It's a very nice summer day. I hope it's nice where everyone is at. Hopefully there's not too many forest fires or the like that are impacting people. First off, I want to thank Mary Groth, Fred Berringham, Claire Admonson, Mary Carmen Guevara for their support. On a positive note, I was at the Verdun. I tried to go to the Verdun beach on Saturday, and with the kids, and at the skate park, I saw some, I guess, graffiti in big abolish NATO, free Palestine, free Assange. That was a nice a sign that the skaters, or at least some of the skaters, are all right. We also had a little rally here, not as big as I would have liked, about 25 people against NATO on Wednesday. So there's a little bit of resistance. The Canada Files today published an article, "The Anti-Palestinian Racism of B'nai B'rith's Jewish Tribune," which goes over the history of that publication's racism against Muslims, racism against Palestinians. There are still people who consider B'nai B'rith a human rights organization, so it's important to point out it's a very right-wing organization that's very anti-Palestinian, pretty openly anti-Muslim often as well. There was a story that provincial premiers met a couple of days ago, I believe in Winnipeg. There's a story in, I don't know if it's National Post, titled "Recruit More Foreign Doctors, Premiers Say." That's a tricky issue. There is, obviously, we need more doctors in Canada, but the business of going and recruiting foreign doctors has a pretty ignoble history in this country, taking doctors from places, trying to induce doctors from places to come to Canada that have far fewer doctors than Canada. So that's always a tricky question. It's totally ridiculous that we haven't trained more doctors. Obviously, a country like Cuba is able to train a whole lot more doctors, and I think it's the power of the medical association historically that has constrained the number of doctors that have been trained. So before going and sort of poaching doctors from places that are even in bigger difficulty on that front, figure out ways of training a whole lot more doctors here. The Wall Street Journal ran a commentary, editorial, so the official editorial board, titled "Canada is a Military Free Rider." They did it a couple day or two before, I believe, of the NATO conference, and it's a extremist. And anyone who's had the chance to read the Wall Street Journal, it's a very fascinating newspaper because its news pages are pretty good in terms of they're not too crazy in their ideological bent, fairly factual kind of whatever. I mean, less so 20 years ago when I first started reading it. I think it was actually much more of a sort of serious paper, closer to the Financial Times, sort of for the business elite, people who know their own self-interest. But then their op-ed and editorial page is completely bananas. It makes the National Post look like it's a kind of a reasonable outlet. It's just really hard line right-wing opinion and editorial pages. Anyways, so this editorial is attacking Canada for not putting more into militarism and being more imperialistic. And what's interesting, it's got a lot of play, a lot of people in the sort of so-called security world, academics, military types, so some of them the more liberalish types complaining about it, some of them backing it and saying, oh, how terrible it is that Canada doesn't give more money to the military. But Bob Ray responded to one of the proponents of that, getting her name, she's a China hawk at the University of Ottawa. And he responded to her on her boasting about this Wall Street Journal editorial, and basically said Canada is pulling its weight in NORAD and NATO and doing all these great imperialistic things and supporting the US from Korea to Afghanistan. And to me, it really sort of, it shows how Bob Ray and the Liberal Party, they respond to the right wing, criticism that Canada is not more militaristic and imperialistic. They don't really respond to the, people saying that Canada's contributing to Palestinian and Haitian subjugation, those who say that the climate crisis is a much, much bigger security threat than what we're being presented, and what is justifying more military spending, that Canada, in fact, aligns its foreign policy and military policy specifically with that of the Pentagon. So it's telling what the Liberals, and specifically some of Bob Ray, who considers himself a sort of humanist internationalist, what he bothers to respond to. And on the note of Bob Ray and Haiti, which he mentions in his tweet, CARICOM Imminent Persons Group traveled to Haiti as a follow-up to the stakeholders meeting in Jamaica. And of course, online, the Haitian activists, North American Haitian activists, very critical of how CARICOM and the Black Alliance for Peace, critical of CARICOM being basically turned into a tool of US Canadian push for a foreign military intervention in Haiti. And that process is continuing. Obviously, Bob Ray is an important player in that process. There's a big International Seabed Authority conference, and I think it's taking place in Jamaica. And one of the things that's pushing it is that there's the Vancouver-based metals company has a whole plan to try to start extracting resources from the bottom of the seabed. There's been a sort of moratorium on that. And at this conference, there's a push to continue this moratorium. And the Canadian government, there's like a dozen governments that had all come out publicly saying, this is not the right thing. We don't know about the ecological damage that this will cause mining the seabed. And the Canadian government had been waffling. They'd refused to come out and support those calling for moratorium. They did a couple of days ago, they did come out publicly and support a moratorium. So that's a good thing. It's not clear to me how serious they are, and the fact that there's these Canadian mining companies are the ones that are pushing to get going at exploiting these resources makes me wonder about where that's all going to play out. But it is good that they at least nominally have supported this initiative for a continued moratorium. In a less positive note, the Trade Minister, Mary Ng, she tweeted meeting with some representatives of a Canadian company operating in Mexico, and she tweeted, "Add women, change mining. This is the kind of sentiment which sets Torex apart and sets the standards for the mining industry in Canada and abroad in Mexico." So she's talking about how I guess they've added some women to their to the board and the CEO and whatever, and so she's boasting that this is this is what makes for a more ethical company. Well, someone on Twitter criticized her for doing this, saying that in fact this company's engaged in significant abuses in Mexico. And just a quick a Google search, I found that one story said, quote, "From 2017 until 2020, the Business and Human Rights Resource Center has registered the killing of 4 labor rights defenders who work directly in or with the mine. So this is a company that has four of its employees have been killed for their labor rights activism, and you have our trade minister like talking about this being an ethical mining company because they brought some women into the power structure. It's just unbelievable. And they've done this with, obviously, I've talked about Barrick Gold in Tanzania, that horrible North Mara mine. Is like dozens, I think it's 60, 70 plus people have been killed there. And you have the Canadian High Commissioner referring to it as upholding the Canadian standards of corporate social responsibility. So clearly they continue with their backing of the mining sector. Now, this week, there was an interesting development on the mining sector front where the CORE, the Corporate Responsibility Ombudsperson, I got the proper name, but it's the ombudsperson that's been mining justice people have been campaigning for probably 2 decades. And there was different kind of formulations. There was like a Foreign Affairs Committee, parliamentary committee back in 2007 that called for this ombudsperson with serious powers. And then the Harper conservatives sort of created this total fake kind of position to deal with a bit of the criticism. And then the Liberals, of course, promised that they were going to, before being elected in 2015, that they would bring in this position and that would have like real investigative powers and would have the power, independent ombudsperson that would have the power to, if they found a company to be responsible for abuses abroad, that they would basically lose public support. And so this ombudsperson was basically Liberals, they dragged their feet on their promise, but then in 2018, they came up with legislation, an announcement the proposal that was actually a pretty good position, that had independence, that had some power to punish companies. And then the mining industry went to full throttle lobbying campaign. And a year and a half later, 16 months later, the proposal was just gutted. And they basically came up with an ombudsperson who had very little power to investigate and could only make a proposal to the international trade minister. So was not really independent anymore, sort of more of an advisor to the trade minister. And so that obviously had happened. And then in response to that, the civil society groups that were part of the process, they all resigned. All 14 of the representatives resigned, and they've been telling victims of Canadian companies abroad not to bother with the process because they don't really have teeth, and then you're wasting your time. You could be exposing yourself to potential repercussions in your home country if you go public in Canada, and even without any real ability for redress. And then on top of this, as part of this sort of industry lobbying process, they expanded it from the extractive sector, which was always what was being focused on, and they brought in the garment industry as well. And that kind of sounds sort of okay, but the real issue, in principle, I don't have a problem with holding all Canadian companies, be it engineering companies, be it banks, be it whatever, that are operating abroad, by having more ability to sort of curtail their abuses. That's obviously in principle, that's a good thing. But in reality, this whole process of bringing in an ombudsperson comes out of a specific, basically foreign policy issue of Canada, of this massive global mining powerhouse with all kinds of government backing, causing abuses all over the world. And so the mining industry wanted to dilute the position by expanding it, which again, in principle, it seems fine to bring in more sectors of corporate Canada, but in practice, this was sort of depoliticizing the whole initiative. Well, what happened this week is that the ombudsperson, who was a former oil lobbyist, that's the Liberals appointed this former oil lobbyist to the position back in 2019, and they haven't done anything since being created in 2019. They haven't done any investigations. And the Globe Mail a couple months ago had big, long kind of expose and sort of embarrassed the position. Well, what they announced this week was that they were going to investigate 2 different companies, Nike and dynasty, gold dynasty, for their involvement with forced labor in China, in Xinjiang, Uyghur labor. So 13 of the 15 cases that are before the ombudsperson have to do with the Uyghurs. So effectively what's happened, and this was on the front page of the Globe Mail, on Wednesday's Globe Mail front page, ombudsperson investigates Nike's forced labor China, or something that effect, all this sort of basically flows into the anti-China narrative. So what was a position that was campaigned for by social movements calling for mining justice and ending this hideous mining behemoth that Canada is promoting, this turned into a tool to basically go with the U.S. empire's campaign to target China, and it's pretty outrageous, pretty shameful on the Liberals for breaking their promise like this, and in the process, in the Globe piece, they point out a couple of things that are quite interesting. One, with basically all these like pro-apartheid, anti-Muslim activists are right at the center of this process. So the lead counsel for this initiative on these two companies that are being investigated now is David Matas and Sarah Tyke. Well, David Matas has been the lawyer for B'nai B'rith going back decades. Okay, he's somebody who explicitly came out on the M100, the bill 103, the thing about Islamophobia that the far right had a big panic about. So he's somebody who's deeply anti-Palestinian, but also pretty openly. I mean, B'nai B'rith has been very openly anti-Muslim, of course. And he himself personally, not just that organization, he personally has publicly intervened in that way. And Sarah Tyke, who used to be part of this called the Canadian Coalition Against Terrorism, which was basically just this group that hyped up, Islamic terrorism. Also, Erwin Kotler's Raoul Wallenberg Center is part of this whole thing about the Uyghurs. So now all these people who've been all into, like Kotler, of course, after that killing in a Muslim family in London, Ontario. What is that? I guess I don't remember, year and a half ago or so. He tweeted out, "There's no Islamophobia in Canada," and was forced to apologize. So Kotler and the B'nai B'rith people even more, they've been anti-Muslim, very openly anti-Muslim. And now they're all about defending Muslim rights in China, which just speaks to how it's just totally politicized. It's just become something that enables the U.S. Empire. So on Tuesday, the National Post put on the front a picture of Olivia Chow, the newly elected mayor of Toronto, with a couple Chinese-looking individuals, and the title was "We Help Chow and Win Mayor's Seat, Pro-Beijing Groups Say." So they're really pushing this idea that Olivia Chow was, the Chinese intervene in elections to get Olivia Chow elected. There's a very good piece just published on Rabble earlier today about this and just the racism. And one of the things that's good about this Rabble piece, I forgot to write down the title, but people can see it on the site, is that it goes into how the media really uses these pro-Washington Chinese Canadian groups to say really racist stuff, right? So they kind of say, oh, it's not us saying it, it's these, it's people of Chinese descent or Hong Kong descent, and there's one quote that again I didn't write down, but it's all about how these mainland Chinese are all brainwashed, and it's really like a hyperbolic kind of explanation for why there may be people in the Chinese Canadian community that don't want to join the U.S. empire bid to target China. The New York Times and the Wall Street Journal this week published articles about the whole question of Chinese interference in Canada. So this is still it's still floating around. It's died down a little bit, but it's still clearly floating around. The National Post wants us to believe that the mayor of Toronto, and I think there's people were saying that the mayor of Vancouver as well. They're also next thing you know, the Chinese are going to go for Medicine Hat. Maybe they're going to then go for a Swift Current and the like. Anyways, in a different development, the investigation about this claims that this Canadian, the global communications chief of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, the bank's investigation of this so-called Chinese Communist Party interference in the bank, it came up with saying no evidence. And the Wall Street Journal story quoting Bob Pritchard, the Canadian official, is it's just, he's got nothing. He doesn't present any examples. He resigned, it's maybe 2 months ago. He resigned from his position, accusing allegations of all this sort of Chinese Communist Party interference. He doesn't present any evidence. And then the Canadian government immediately, within hours, ends its or suspends its involvement with the bank. So almost for sure this is all coordinated. And now this investigation, obviously by the bank itself, but they're not finding anything of substance. The federal government announced that basically all Ukrainian refugees that applied for a visa or in Canada, I think 1.1 million people, quite a large number of people, that they can all get citizenship by October 2025 if they'd already applied as of a couple of days ago, and if they are in the country by March of next year. And then they would get citizenship by 2025. This is a big, potentially very big. And obviously in the press release, the immigration minister uses it to talk about, the illegal invasion, rightfully so at one level, but also then talks about, this is about the, I have the French quote, the insensé violence, the sort of gratuitous violence of the Russians. So uses it to take another hit at the Russians. Now this issue, I think this is a good move. Obviously, there's many Ukrainians that have been horribly devastated by this war, and Canada opening up the borders on this front seems like a humanitarian gesture. And just in general, I think we should be more accommodating. But it does open up a couple of different questions. And well, first of all, this is a question for Ukraine. I just saw a story talking about demographics in Ukraine, and it's just stunning. The country's demographics have just, I think it was talk about it being down to as little as 28 million people in the country now. And that what it's increasingly looking like is the generosity of the European countries, and Canada for that matter, in terms of taking in Ukrainian refugees. That's basically, most people don't want to go back. And then with all the killing and all that's gone on, Ukraine, there's very little chance that things aren't going to be a total disaster, even after the current disaster actually ends, even after the worst of the horrors end. But so there's a question on that front for Ukraine's future. But then there's a whole question about the racism, right? So the Globe and Mail had a piece titled Sudanese Canadians Feel Abandoned as Relatives Await Travel Documents. So the Canadian government, with the war in Sudan, which has been really brutal, it doesn't get much attention here. I watch Al Jazeera. Al Jazeera's had very good coverage of it. They have a correspondent in Khartoum, so they've actually covered it quite closely. So it's quite horrible, quite devastating warfare. From what I can tell, Canada doesn't have much of a role in it, so I don't talk about it much. But for the people who are there, and including Canadians or people who have connections to Canada who are there, the difference in treatment is pretty striking. And this Globe story talks about individual, I think they were in Cairo, and they're basically waiting to get into Canada, get travel documents for family to get to Canada, and they're just all their money in their apartment in Toronto, they're paying for that, and they're paying for another place in Cairo, all their savings. And it's just basically the government's not really, helping out that much. But while they haven't, sort of said, any Sudanese who want to come to Canada can come in, right? They haven't done close to what they've done with Ukraine. So there's an obvious racist element to that. And Jemima Pierre responded, the Haitian academic, she responded to a tweet about this issue, and she said, I think the term you're looking for here is not exceptional, but white supremacist. Canada is trying to whiten its already very white population. And I think there's probably important degree of truth to that assessment of the treatment of Ukrainians versus Sudanese and other places where there's been warfare. Early in the Russian invasion, a lot of people on the left were really into focusing on the racist elements, the racist double standard. And I think, rightfully, because there was a very obvious racist double standard. But I also think that there's a geopolitical dimension that doesn't really doesn't really fit with the racist double standard, which is that, the people in eastern Ukraine that were basically bearing the brunt of the violence for 8 years, they were very white, they're very light skinned, and there was almost no interest in what was happening to them. And that's geopolitics. That's not race, that's geopolitics. That's because they were viewed as whatever, pro-Russia, and the people killing them were viewed as pro-West or pro-NATO, and or the people that they were at war with. So I think it's important to point out the racist element, but it's also important to not overplay some of that dimension, or to see that there are other dimensions, should I say, to understanding the stark double standard. The National Post, I think on Thursday, the front page was "Cluster Munitions for Ukraine, a Necessary Evil." And right across the front page, took up most of the front page, and it was a former 35-year Lieutenant Canadian General, former head of the Royal Military College in Saint-Jean. I think he said in the bio, last Chief of Staff to NATO's Supreme Allied Command. Michel, and I don't have, I chopped off part of his name here, so I don't have his full name. He won the Vimy Award last year, and there was big controversy because he was viewed as, what he said was viewed as not very, kind of undermined the whole question of sexual assault within the military, which got a lot of attention. Anyways, he's basically in the National Post front page saying, well, we got to send cluster munitions, we got to support sending cluster munitions. And I published a piece on Rabble about the cluster bombs, Canada's position. And I last week I quoted Anita Anand in the Politico, where she refused to criticize the Americans directly about it. She sort of said, we don't like these cluster munitions, but basically it's the Russians are the bad, the Russians are the baddies. Trudeau the next day, as the criticism, global criticism, and within the US grew of this cluster bombs donation from the US, Trudeau put out a statement, or he responded to a question that was a bit more critical. And then the next day, on Tuesday, Melanie Joly actually criticized the Americans. But they were like, it was reluctant. They were reluctant to do that. And in the piece that I published on Rabble on my site, I go through that, Canada's cluster munition is very slow to take the cluster munition, to sign a cluster munition convention. I think like almost 100 countries have signed it before Canada. The legislation bringing up the cluster munitions, Canada basically can still work with militaries, operate alongside militaries that are using cluster munitions, which of course means the US, as we're referring to. But in the story, I go through some of how the Liberals, or sort of how Canada has been really ambivalent contrary to the mythology that Canada's been ambivalent to lots of arms control measures, from nuclear arms to arms trade treaty to UN bans, official UN Security Council resolutions opposing weapons. That goes back to like even with apartheid South Africa, Libya more recently, and so Canada is very ambivalent because of its relationship to the U.S. military, because of its relationship to NATO, because of the arms industry and Canada's arms export industry. They're very ambivalent towards arms control measures. And the Liberals themselves, a few months ago, actually opposed an NDP resolution on the Cluster Bombs Convention that would have strengthened Canada's alignment with the spirit of the convention, and something that they themselves said they supported when they were in opposition. The Kyiv Independent has a video. I didn't watch the whole video. I just watched the Twitter clip, a brief sort of teaser for the longer YouTube video clip. And the title is, "Was Stephen Bandera good or evil?" Well, Stephen Bandera is part of the Ukrainian nationalists group back during World War II that were allied with the Nazis. His forces were responsible for 100,000 plus killings of Poles in Western Ukraine, and really like an ethnic cleansing campaign, as well as killings of Jews, but real targeting of the Polish community to try to like wipe out Poles, and allied with the Nazis. So the like every political figure is always a little bit more complicated than complete demonization. Like Hitler complete demonization, or so there is, you can have like but politically speaking, this is somebody who was allied with the Nazis and all kinds of horrors, and so, but what's interesting from a Canadian perspective is that the Kyiv Independent was basically set up with Canadian money. And it was another publication that went under back in 2021, and the Canadian government stepped in with this emergency $200,000 donation, and they also, I don't have the quote here. Yeah, the Canadian director of the Embassy for Development Program, Ashley Moroney, said the grant was, quote, part of broader Canadian support for free media and democratization in Ukraine. And so this is a publication that's been very influential during this war, and it's just one small example. This is sort of like Nazi apologism from this publication, and Canada is all is right at the middle of this process, because the Kyiv Independent is targeting Russia. It's because it's a publication that's English language publication targeting Russia, and so this is one little bit of Canada's contribution to a whole network within Ukraine, in terms of building up these sort of pro-NATO forces in the country. And even if they sometimes or often have this sort of fascistic side to their politics. I wanted to touch a little bit on a couple other questions, kind of running. I gotta maybe going to go through this a little bit quicker than I planned. So one question about NATO. Okay, so we had this NATO convention, and there's a couple stories, couple of posts that I thought were worth raising. One, that this idea that NATO is sort of a democratic force, right? And NATO, of course, had Portugal while it was under military dictatorship. It was a dictatorship for many years. It also had the military rulers in Greece, and it they ousted Yanukovych in 2014, partly because he was supportive of neutrality. He wasn't pro-NATO. That's part of why Canada helped oust him. There's also an example in 97. I wasn't familiar with this history, but the New York Times story talked about it, where the Czech Republic was going to have a referendum on joining NATO, and the public polling was saying no. And so what they did is they just scrapped the referendum with the Secretary General of NATO, and then 2 years later they just joined. So there's these examples of just ignoring public opinion. And I should say that in 2008, when the process of joining NATO got pushed in for Ukraine, the polling showed most Ukrainians didn't want to join NATO at that time. The majority didn't want it. And American officials, the internal cables, talked about that, how it was going to rip the country in two, the whole question of joining NATO. Now, on a Canadian example, this was pointed out by Doc Curry on Twitter yesterday, 2 days ago. Well, there's a whole example in Canada. So John Diefenbaker's government, John Diefenbaker was basically, like a low-level sort of American-sponsored coup, if you want, against Diefenbaker in '63, where NATO was right at the center of. And in two different ways. It was the issue they put was to have U.S. nuclear weapons in Canada, and they pushed that Canada was not fulfilling its obligations under NATO by not hosting the Beaumark missiles, and which Diefenbaker opposed. And there was this whole process of Lester Pearson, who was then the Liberal Party leader, who had been, I have a book about Pearson, very, very deeply tied with the American State Department and Kennedy and administration, etc. And they, on January 3rd, the outgoing head of NATO, U.S. General Lawrence Norstad, made a visit to Ottawa, a surprise visit, where he claimed Canada would not be fulfilling its commitments to NATO if it didn't acquire nuclear warheads. And this was all part of a process that led to the dissolution of the Diefenbaker government, and then the Kennedy administration will directly help Pearson in the election. There, the lead pollster for Kennedy comes to Canada and helps the campaign, Pearson's campaign. And there's accusations from Diefenbaker and his foreign minister that the CIA was involved and stuff like that. Anyways, NATO was part of this whole process. I don't think it's the only part. There was this disagreement with Diefenbaker over Cuba and the Cuban Missile Crisis and stuff like that. But nonetheless, NATO played a role in this sort of the ouster of Canadian Prime Minister. So the whole democracy question should be about NATO, should definitely be challenged. So the Liberals announced last week that they were going to be doubling the troop commitment to. They were going to be doubling Canada's troop commitment to Latvia, from a bit under 1,000 to 2,200. Okay, so the Canadian press story about this says, this is how it starts. It says, quote, "It will take another 3 years for Canada to make good on its commitment to grow a multinational NATO battle group in Latvia to Combat Ready Brigade," Prime Minister Justin Trudeau revealed Monday. So the opening statement of this Canadian press story is framing this big announcement of massively increasing Canadian troops on Russia's doorstep as basically it's not enough. It's going to be too slow, right? We have almost 1,000 Canadian troops on a bordering country of Russia. We're talking about more than doubling that. Like the media, there's never enough, right? For the media, it's never enough. There's no amount of military spending, no amount of military deployments that's ever enough. The whole bias of the framing is always, Canada's not doing enough. It's just completely remarkable, rather than what the serious, sensible framing would be something like, in a highly provocative move to ratchet up tensions in Eastern Europe, Canada is more than doubling its troops on Russia's border. That would be like a more honest opening paragraph of the Canadian press story, but that's not what they did. Now, the NATO summit, the front page of the Globe on Thursday or Friday was NATO once more snubs Kyiv in its bid to facilitate peace with Russia. So basically, Zelensky didn't get what he wanted with regards to the NATO commitments of a timeline. I guess he wants NATO to, Ukraine to join NATO today, which would of course mean war with Russia. But if not that, he wants like a direct timeline, and NATO refused. Basically, the Americans and the Germans said, this is just too crazy. It's just completely guaranteeing this goes on forever. And then, the Russians really would have a self-interest in just having it go on forever, because they would need war to keep going on to make sure that Ukraine can't join NATO, because if they're at war, they can't join NATO because that would force NATO to go to war with Russia. So the Americans stepped in and did and said, we're not going to have a timeline. Now, one of the things which the Globe Mail complained about on the front page, and we're snubbing Kyiv. NATO is snubbing Kyiv to facilitate peace with Russia. Anyways, if NATO just wouldn't have tried to push this whole expansion, Ukraine wouldn't be destroyed. But that's too complicated for them to understand. But what you see, what to me the whole comes out of the NATO summit is that the Americans, Ukrainians are just being they're getting played. It's becoming clearer and clearer they're getting played. Their country's destroyed. They're going to lose huge amount of territory. Ultimately, NATO is probably not even going to they're probably never not even going to join NATO, maybe not even the European Union. But it's been great for US power in Europe because you got Sweden and Finland that joined NATO, you got Germany and the EU that's become like totally subordinate to US security policy. And so, ultimately, Ukrainians are going to suffer at the hands of this American-led effort to basically subordinate Western Europe to its objective. I think that one of the things to me that comes out of the NATO conference, as one person put it on Twitter, it may be dangerous to be America's enemy, but to be America's friend is fatal. Ukraine was sacrificed by Washington for the supposed sacrosanct right to join NATO. Even though the US knew Ukraine joining NATO would be the last red line for Russia, and silently acknowledged Ukraine could not join before the full-scale war started last year. So I think that to me is likely where this is all heading, and what we're seeing coming out of the counteroffensive is not the success that was being trumpeted, and huge numbers of deaths, huge numbers of destruction. It's just really a stunning, sad, unfortunate that this is just looks like it's going to prolong. Now, to conclude, to get into the concluding issue I want to talk about was this just absolute panic that we're seeing on the online towards a piece, mostly of what I wrote on Dimitri Lascaris's effort to shut him down, but also the piece that Dimitri wrote, a piece titled "The Struggle for Peace is a Struggle for Free Speech," where he goes into just all the efforts to shut down his tour, and those are of course very significant efforts. And there's all these like fanatical, if you delve through these people, military funded commentators, people like Marcus Kolga, or he's funded by U.S. State Department, Boucher, funded by Canadian military, Dominic Cardy, Kyle Matthews. That Kyle Matthews is the head of the Montreal Institute for Genocide and Human Rights Studies, which partners with the Canadian and U.S. military. It's been this group that pushed the so-called will to intervene, which was just an expansion of the responsibility to protect doctrine, which was used to destroy Libya in 2011 and also was used to justify Canada's military intervention in Haiti. And so people like Matthews and Cardy, Kolga, Boucher were openly trying to shut Lascaris's tour down. Well, you know, Matthews, the guy at MIGS, the Montreal Institute for Genocide Studies, Human Rights Studies, that institute's totally tied in with Romeo Dallaire and Paul Kagame, right? So he's all about calling like myself and Dmitry and others as Putinists. Well, you know, I mean, we've all condemned what Russia's done and Putin's done many times in my case. But you know, he's never said anything about Paul Kagame's violence in Eastern Congo. And even though his institute is all tied in with Kagame, but so there's this piece that I published, that the Jacobin published of mine, titled "Wartime Red Baiting and Repression Paved the Way for Canada's Current Suppression of Anti-War Voices." And it's mostly just a rehashing of stuff that bits I published in a number of different places. I brought it together for Jacobin because it's a bit more of a mainstream, bit of a bigger audience, and I'm making the point that what we're seeing today is kind of like a regression back to the time sort of before, you know, during the Korean War or earlier. So we haven't really seen in the last 50 years. And you know, like in recent wars, there's been really elaborate propaganda exercises by the military, by the government to try to, you know, shape the information, suppress information. But the sort of like out and out like repression of anti-war thought and meetings has been pretty minimal. There's been some smear campaigns, but you know, during Afghanistan, they obviously smeared Jack Layton, Taliban Jack, when he proposed negotiations with the Taliban. But for the most part, this sort of like really kind of that stuff it died down. But what we've seen in the last 18 months is just its open season, right? Where, you know, tanky campists, Putinists funded by Russia, Chinese state agents, you know, it's just total out and out attacks. And then of course you see these open campaigns to cancel every event. And so to me, what this piece is doing is kind of going over some of this history. And basically over the last 15 years, there hasn't been any mass mobilizations, anti-war mobilizations, anti-NATO mobilizations since sort of 2008. 2008, it may have been, you know, a bit after that, but the last major demonstrations around Afghanistan I'm familiar with was 2008. And so what's happened is that the anti-war forces have become much more marginalized in the mainstream, much less support from unions or other sort of social organizations. And so that's allowed for this sort of really open attacks that we've seen in the last 18 months. And so even if you don't agree with what, you know, Dmitry is saying on the Russian war in Ukraine and the NATO proxy war, it's just a dangerous return to a different time in Canadian political life. And we're not even formally at war, right? Like if we actually went formally at war with Russia, it would ramp up another step. Or if we go to war with China, it would ramp up a whole other level. So we got to be worried about this. So anyway, that's the point of the piece. Now, it got the freak out from all of the people who tried to cancel Dimitri's events, of course. Those people all freaked out. But also this whole layer of the left, so-called left. They call themselves left, often they call themselves anarchists, anti-fascists. I wrote a piece about this last week. Canada Files published a piece where I go through, you know, some of the smears against Dmitry. They were, you know, sort of trying to say he has to be shut down now because he's tied to people who are transphobic, and so they brought in like sort of a left-wing justification for shutting him down. Those people also went completely bananas on Twitter against this piece, and it's just remarkable to see this. You know, they throw it all, right? They throw it all at us, at me and Dmitry, and you know us, I think in general, just basically kind of anti-imperialist, anti-NATO, anti-war voices, they have this whole like ideology. They have an ideology of canceling events. That's one thing that's kind of fascinating in of itself. Then they have this whole like ideology. They claim there's red-brown. So they're basically the far right and the far left getting together. And that's how they frame the need to shut all this stuff down, is because supposedly like the critics of NATO and they're like, you know, in bed with the fascists, and so they have to like disrupt these lefty critics of NATO, because if not, then it's going to lead to fascism taking over. I mean, I don't know. I mean, if you look at me personally, my historical, you know, I mean, I've book with capitalism in the title. I've been, you know, openly written lots about being anti-capitalist, anti-racist, international. I mean, you know, like, okay, you could say like maybe, you know, closet. I'm a closet far right wing. I mean, you know, whatever, right? That's the. Some of it becomes quite kind of like pretty stupid, but this is what they're claiming. This is how they're justifying all this shutting down of stuff, and it's really fascinating to see it. And so, anyways, I thought I've gone on a little longer than I expected. I think I'll leave it at that. Open it up to questions. I don't think that that Laura is with us, so I'm going to try to you know, get anybody who's got their hands. I'll if I'm missing people, I apologize, and if some people can tell me, go ahead. I'm not seeing anybody with questions or comments yet, but sometimes I'm not able to see that properly. Okay, go ahead. I can see your physical hand, John. So go ahead, John. And if you can see other people, I'm trying to unmute you here. And if you can see other people that have their hand raised in the more formal way, that would be great after you're done your comment or question. Go ahead, John.
Yeah, well, while we're waiting, I was wondering whether is Lascaris still speaking publicly? He's a very convincing speaker, and it'd be good to have him back as a guest, maybe on this. And in the meantime, that's the only question I have.
Okay. Yeah. No, I don't think I think he's done his tour. I'm guessing it was a pretty busy couple of weeks there that he was pretty overwhelmed. He's probably trying to take a little bit of a break. But I definitely will think of having Dimitri on. And if people have ideas for other people to have on, even people who are, you know, a bit more US focused, I wanted to get on actually today the Ranko Masvidic or something like that for Jacobin. He writes a lot about NATO, but I couldn't actually find his email. I was going to email him over the weekend, but I couldn't find his email. But anyway, so people have ideas, send me emails with ideas of speakers, and if you have a contact, that's also very helpful. Go ahead, Nadia. I'm seeing your hand is formally raised.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yeah, yeah.
Thank you so much, Yves. I admire your courage. I can't believe you have so much courage. It's unbelievable. They must be demonizing you in the public sphere. I'm just wondering, when you see something in the Globe and Mail or in the policies of our government that you don't like, do you send them a tweet or an email or something to show your disapproval?
You know, mostly not. I mean, I respond to Just Peace Advocates and CJPME, Canadian Foreign Policy Institute, and other, you know, IJV or other just sort of random groups. You know, I'm on the lists of you know, a whole bunch of different Council Canadians. I signed different petitions and stuff like that. I very rarely you know, reach out to the minister after I find some piece of information. I often on Twitter, I will often respond to Anita Anand or Trudeau or you know, Melanie Joly or other Canadian, for Bob Ray, and I find that that's useful, because I especially if you respond quickly after they posted a thing. I often find, I get hundreds of people that, like it and share it. And often it's not that much work for me to summarize a quick response to whatever they're saying, because I'm, following the issues usually. So I do that. I actually find Twitter quite good for that. But no, for the other kind of, sending an email or stuff like that, I don't usually.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm suggesting that perhaps when you bring these issues to our attention, perhaps each one of us should send an email or a tweet or something, because it's a matter of numbers. The more people who object and protest, the more they listen to us.
Yeah. I mean, if people wanted to create, I wouldn't have the time to engage with it much. But if people wanted to create a little, I don't know, little committee or something like that of the Cape Foreign Policy Hour, if whatever, just informal group that took some of what comes out of this discussion or other foreign policy discussions and come up with a action alert. Right, there's technologies now that make it pretty easy to put in the contact. You can do multiple ministers, and then people, all they have to do is just say put in their email address, and it fires the email to the minister. And Canadian Foreign Policy Institute and Just Peace Advocates, we've collaborated on some that have gotten thousands and thousands. Just Peace Advocates, that some get up to like 10,000 people that on Palestine related stuff that respond. And we know that it gets on the radar. We've seen the internal government documents. One that Karen Rodman from Just Peace Advocates talked to me about around I forget what it was in Ontario, something around Palestine, and I think a resolution to try to ban BDS or something like that. And in the access information she got, the officials count. They said basically it was evenly matched. The pro-Israel lobby was able to mobilize 1,000 emails or whatever the number was exactly, and the sort of pro-Palestinian world did a similar amount, and the officials paid attention to that. So I totally agree that it's useful. It can be impactful, but it's also it is also of course work, like all of these things. But
don't you think if we do it individually, it might be more forceful, more powerful?
Well, that's what I'm saying. But it's best as a coordinated thing, right? It's best as somebody comes up with a complaint and then sends it around to a list. I would be happy. I mean, potentially, depending, assuming it's a good action alert. When I send out the email each week to the now is about almost 1,000 people on the list for the Canadian Foreign Policy Hour, I'd be happy to put in one link each week to some action that was foreign policy related. Just put it at the bottom of the somewhere in the email, and say, hey, take 1 minute to email so and so. And the Canadian Foreign Policy Institute list does that regularly, and so does JPA, does it even more, and other groups do it sometimes. And it's also you can also share it on Twitter and Facebook, though unfortunately the social media world has really undermined a lot of that stuff. The algorithms and stuff have made that stuff difficult, but there are definitely ways to get the stuff out there. But go ahead, Hans.
Okay, I'm unmuted, and I'll lower my hand. Anyway, I'm equally puzzled as you are by some former comrades that I still respect highly, that are with us on most topics, but on this Ukraine issue, they dissent with me, and sometimes quite offensively, I might add, or hostile. One guy that's asked me not to send him any more emails about us or about Dimitri or about Aaron Mate is Richard Fiddler, who is an accredited marxist And if you can entice him to come on and explain his point of view, I would view that a challenge, a very interesting one. I rest my case. See whether you can charm him into joining us for a debate.
I'll consider that. I'll think about that. If you remind me in a day or two, I'll think about it. And if you remind me in a day or two or a week or so or whatever, I'll think about
Send
that.
you
Yeah.
I'll send you an email.
There was
I'm actually vacationing right now, so
okay, yeah, we're no huge hurry. There was somebody who also had their hand up that just disappeared from my thing. But John, I think you just 2 seconds. I'm trying to unmute you here, John. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, there just to let you know, perhaps people don't know, but there are a couple of blogs in the United States that are very good on the war and very critical of the war, and increasingly so, and very informative. And one of them is called Popular Resistance. I think it's out of the Eastern United States, and it has very good articles. And then there's another one called Truth Out. That's, I think, on the west coast of the United States, and both of them you can find them very readily, and they sometimes come out twice in a day, but they have a whole series of very good articles and very good information.
Yeah, and I should say, I also just say on that, Cornel West, who's running now, I guess, for the Green Party presidential stuff, he was on CNN and he made a really hard, strong comment on the NATO proxy war, and I think that some of this like panic freak out that we're seeing with regards to the tour that Dimitri did and regards to this Jacobin article is partly that there is actually a shift. Right, there is there early on there was very little space. Space is actually opening up a little bit to challenge some of this stuff. So yeah, go ahead, Yuri. This I think will probably be the final question, unless I'm not seeing anyone else. But yeah, we're past 7, but I'm also not seeing anyone else. Go ahead.
Well, I was going to save my question for another time, but there was a guy called Jake that had his hands raised.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. It was Jake. Yes, I saw. Yeah, I can't.
But now he seems to have lowered his hand, unless.
Oh, he has lowered it. Okay. Yeah. So I'll. Okay. Maybe
still here, Jake, or.
Yeah, I mean, he might not be there anyway. Anyways, do you have a question or a comment or?
Okay. Well, just very quickly, your response to I guess I wanted your response to CARICOM, which I guess is still bowing to the lobbying efforts of another intervention in Haiti. But I wanted to respond on that, but also CARICOM, was that also set up to be just another lackey of Anglo-American Canadian imperialism?
At some point, I think I did look into CARICOM's roots, and I don't have, I don't know. Maybe simple answer. I don't think it was necessarily that bad of a historical root, but I'm not actually sure. Maybe John seems to be wanting to chime in, but with regards to the Haiti stuff, yes. I mean, I think that, people pointed out that, they're only pushing for one, right? There was recently Ariel Henry at the behest of the IMF, ended subsidy for cooking, primarily cooking oil, more generally, which really hits the poor hard. And they're not coming out with any statements. So they're not like it's very one directional in how CARICOM is sort of, Haiti's problems are, security, we need foreign forces, not even, obviously anyone who looks at Haiti, there's tons and tons of like inequity problems and right, like this, but so even recently, policies that have been pursued recently, they're not even sort of like intervening on, critical on those things. So which just speaks to how they are being they're doing the dirty work of the U.S. and Canada.
Unbelievable. And keep up the great work. And I also feel your frustration with all the craziness that's been going on these past couple of days.
So I guess this will be the real last one. Go ahead, Elizabeth.
Yes. Yeah. Is anybody considering how much that war is contributing to global warming and also to inflation, of course? But global warming is probably more of a danger than anything else. We should have a moratorium for at least 2 years on all wars. And that would certainly help the climate a lot.
You're here. Yeah, I mean, I think the even stronger is that could you, like, if you sit and think about security right now and you're seeing these like wildfires that are just like pulverizing all across the country, and your reaction to like what you call security is spending a bunch of money on naval vessels and fighter jets, right? That's what the security world. Actually, I was going to play the clip today. I asked Stephen Guilbeault at I was going to intervene at this press conference. I asked him about spending it was about social housing and spending $100 billion, $350 billion over the life cycle on fighter jets and naval vessels. I say, well, why don't you put that money into social housing? You want to talk about security? I mean, have people ensuring that people have houses over their heads is far greater than the other security threats. But the climate crisis is to me is just the clearest. I mean, since Lytton, what happened in Lytton, BC, where the town was literally obliterated after the hottest day on record, or 3 of the hottest days in a row, or whatever it was on record. Obviously, this is a far bigger security concern than anything. Even the most, you believe this most outlandish stuff about Russia. Even if you believe the climate crisis is still a bigger security concern. For Canadians, I mean, maybe not for Poles or for Lithuania, but for Canadians. So I mean, it's just yeah. And then what, as you point out, there's I think Abby Martin just did a video. I haven't watched it. I think I saw a clip of it on a little announcement about on Twitter. Did a video apparently just all about how the American military and just how ecologically damaging it is, and apparently it's good. I haven't seen it, but yeah.
To fly a jet for 1 hour. I don't know how many cars you can drive for how many hours. Is very, very, very polluting. I think if we would emphasize that more, maybe that might make more sense than anything else, because we all feel it. It all,
Yeah, and the F-35s are even worse than the F-16s, and the best of them, the ones they're trying to buy, are even worse than the previous jets. So yeah, obviously the climate crisis is just the military machine contributes to it, and in a whole bunch of different direct and indirect ways.
Well, we bought those planes in case there's a war with Russia or China. Well, if there's a war with Russia and China, we're not going to survive it anyway. Why bother?
Yeah. So thanks everyone. Same place, same time next week. Take care. Have a good evening.